Hey, what up? This is Dee Kei from the Mixing Music Podcast. If you want more in-depth mixing content, check out our exclusive ad-free episodes for just $3.99 a month. You'll get 2 new technique-focused episodes every week, co-hosted by James, and immediate access to our entire back catalog of over 200 episodes. It's straight to the point, no fluff, just pure audio techniques. Head to mixingmusicpodcast.com/exclusive and subscribe now. Hello and welcome back to the Mixing Music Podcast. I'm your host, Dee Kei, and with me today is actually a special guest, someone who I've talked about on the show many times, and I did not realize has never been on the show before. This is my good friend, classmate, former classmate, and now thriving producer, composer, just a total nerd about music. My very good friend, the amazing Gavin McMahan. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, dude. Yeah, if people don't know, we've been longtime adult friends. I mean, we were in like the first class together in music school like 10 years ago, which is wild. Bands at the same time, figured out everything at the same time.
Yeah, cool. I forget about this every once in a while, unless like a Facebook memory pulls up. Like, there was like a venue we ran a while for like a very indie venue. What a wild time. Yeah, it's we've had a lot of fun together, had a lot of adventures. And somehow we've stuck it through and continued to do music in our own separate paths. You have a home studio that is super nice that you've built out. You bought a home and tricked out the basement basically. And it's not your normal basement home studio. It's a full out fleshed out thing. So, and I know it's been many years since you've built it, but you continue to renovate it as well and continue to change things around. I know that you and your wife Nicole are building a desk right now, redoing a desk. That's super cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. So welcome to the Mixing Music universe. Again, I've talked about you on the show here and there on occasion, so I just didn't realize you've never been on the show. Well, welcome, dude.
Thanks.
Yeah, we're excited to talk about something that I think will be really helpful. Lou and I, we've talked about the importance, the value from a technical perspective as an engineer to work with and gain some experience with acoustic instruments. And I think we're going to kind of go deeper into that topic. So we were talking about, Gavin and I, we were texting and we're talking about general mix notes and how Gavin has an affinity. I mean, being a composer and a producer, you can go full on pop as well as just go cinematic trailer, like, right? You're like very heavily into like hand notation as well. Big theory guy. And this is what you see. I'm going to read the text verbatim. I think we're going to start off with there. He said, "The whole classical music approach to acoustic ensemble recordings is a kind of niche in our world of splice and serum songs. It's just something I've personally obsessed over because I do it a lot. Serious upper mid-range management, niche panning tools, niche early reflection reverb solutions to make close mic things sound like they're recorded with the main pair of like room mics. You can't approach it like a splice, keys, guitar, and a beat type thing. Very different." I think this is like very true. And I think this is going to be very useful across the board to anybody listening, especially because some of these, dare I say, I wonder if these techniques will work where there are a lot of samples and VIs, virtual instruments, that emulate very closely a real acoustic environment as well, or like songs that you want it to be mixed like or engineered like it sound really acoustically there. And from what I understand within the composer world, Utah is kind of a cool niche for composers because Utah is, if I'm not mistaken, specifically known for being able to hire composers that can make digital instruments come to life and sound real and unique. Is that kind of what I understand about the market of composers out there?
Yeah, I don't know what it is, but there's some crazy things happening in Utah with composers. We have a mutual friend, J. Scott Riccozzi, and Peter Murray, and these guys are the Hogwarts game. These are just people like living in suburbs in Utah. And so there's just a thing here. I don't know what it is, but there's, I think, just a big value for this kind of music. And so you see this professionally as well. But yeah, it's very real here. As small as it is, it's no LA, it's no London, but it's very real. People are really trying.
Sure, probably related to tax breaks as well. You know, it's funny. I literally just beat Hogwarts Legacy like 2-3 days ago. So
cool.
Shout out to J. Scott and Peter.
Yeah,
cool stuff. And remember that time? This is 10 years ago now when we went to visit another big composer in Utah. This is while we were both in school. Like we went to like a home studio tour, and he had like a crazy supercomputer with like 2 terabytes of RAM or something like that.
Oh, probably Lyle Moore.
Yeah. And that was like the first time I was introduced, like where Lyle, like, do you remember when he's like had this whole iPad set up and all of his macros, and he's like, I can make the instruments breathe, listen to the swelling that I can automate while I'm playing. And it was like the first time I was like, holy crap, like you can really make this virtual instrument sound real. That was like really interesting to see that. But let's talk about first off, let's talk about kind of from a more macro perspective as we kind of dive deeper as well and go into the more micro details here. Why do people these days kind of prefer acoustic instruments still?
I mean, that's a philosophical question, a sociological question, I guess. Well, I'll go back to an anecdotal memory. I remember when I was a teenager and had my bands that were kind of punkish. They were rock bands, guitars and drums, kind of pop punk. But also really loved all sorts of music, was raised in a musical family, listened to classical, jazz, lots of theater. My mom's a theater heavyweight. And lots of folky stuff too. And I remember always feeling like I loved my kind of punk bands, that kind of Warped Tour era. And that's the music I was making with my band in high school. But I remember then pivoting just like to listening to some folksy, more acoustic music, just driving my car around as a 16-year-old or whatever, and just feeling such like a, I don't know, like an openness, like a release, like I could breathe a little bit. This isn't to put it above other kind of music at all, but I think perhaps in this sort of algorithmic social media streaming world is kind of like, what's the word? It's like a movement to sort of embrace more organic things, just like a lot of millennials like to go hiking a lot. Lots of millennials have the whole like record collector thing. They're like, all this music is so easy and it's becoming so disposable. So they start to buy records and try and purposely slow things down. So I think there's kind of there's some of that going on. Also, I think some of it's just kind of timeless. I mean, also like kind of acoustic guitar, folksy music has never really gone away. I think obviously the orchestra has never really gone away, largely thanks to movies. There's never been a year where like there hasn't been a top 10 song that had strings on it, you know. They're kind of timeless, but I think there is like a sense of, and maybe in our world as producers, engineers, like samples, clippers, decapitator, all this like hype, like approaching white noise. Like the music gets so dense and so gnarly and impressive and amazing. And I love this. Again, I'm like half pop producer. I love this. But I think when we get into that world, there's a craving for something that's just like open and round and breathes and just pulling up a guitar and playing, you know. So I think there is sort of kind of like a revolution, like a crusade. But at the same time, it's also just like, it's timeless. It never stopped. It's never going away. It'll always kind of be there, I think, too.
Yeah. I like how you immediately said this is more like philosophical by nature, because I wonder, yeah, there's a lot of thoughts behind it. Obviously, there's something human about individual mistakes. Have you seen, there's like videos of like when one person sings out of tune, it's very obvious. But if you put a bunch of slightly out of tune singers together in a choir, it sounds like it's actually in pitch. There's some, and like all of the little micro modulations kind of make it make it like a choir sounds like, or like a a 12-string guitar that's perfectly in tune is not as cool or as sparkly as a 12-string guitar that's like each octave is slightly out of tune, like a couple cents out. Stuff like that. Yeah, something human about that. What do you think about let's start from a recording perspective. No, sorry. Let me go back. Let's start from an arrangement perspective, producing an arrangement. When arranging music and producing music with real instruments, what are some of the main issues that people should be thinking about?
There's a lot. I mean, this is a big thing. Let me back up a touch to that question just by saying that I think this applies to all genres too. I think if you're kind of in this splice and serum world, and plus a guitar, if that's kind of your world, I think this totally applies to you. I think this is not exclusive to live instruments. I think people that work primarily with live instruments tend to run into these things a little bit more quickly because typically you're hiring somebody else and you have to write down what they play unless they're just a kind of improvising. So there's more of it's more obvious about some of these problems where if you're just doing with cool sounds, you can just kind of rely on the sounds to make the arrangement work as opposed to the notes. So let me back up a little bit by saying that this is a thing. This kind of craft-oriented approach to arranging is still is a thing. It has been a thing for a long time. You think of all these classically trained, or at least formally trained producers in pop: Quincy Jones, David Foster, Mark Ronson, George Martin with the Beatles. A lot of these guys got degrees in composition or in arranging, and then got into pop. And so they brought all this sort of ability to arrange and organize sound very neatly into the pop world. So I don't think it's a genre thing, which is why I think this is really helpful for everyone. And again, this is people go to school for 4 years and then they do a master's for 4 years to learn how to arrange music. And that's the very, very beginning. And a lot of my heroes that are in their 60s are very vocal about they're still learning. They're buying scores and analyzing. They're taking courses online. People that are old that have a dozen Grammys are taking online courses right now to learn how to arrange. It's a huge, huge thing. But a couple techniques that I think are very quick to understand and very important that I see kind of messed up a lot, that also I think apply to exclusively mixing engineers, because we have this idea of frequency fighting and this idea that get that right in the arrangement first, but there is a way to get that right. One of the most important things that's really easy to understand is this idea of overlap. So if you look at a piano and you have all these different areas, trying to find out, for example, where the vocal is, say it's in between the G below middle C and the G above it, and then try and put your instruments somewhere else. So this isn't a frequency thing. This isn't an EQ thing. This isn't a mic thing. This is the notes. What notes are they playing? There is a way to have overlap and have it work. In fact, that's really important and really cool to have things in the same area. But I think it's a good exercise to at least start to be aware of what's happening. If you're writing a song on guitar or something, try and figure out what you're singing and play it on guitar and get out of the way for the chords you might play, An analogy I'll use for this a lot is painting. Let me grab a piece of paper. I've done this so many times. And it's funny because it makes it so obvious. But say you want to draw a painting, okay? So here's your guy. Sorry for people that are, maybe my camera can't even pick it up. Okay, so you have a stick figure, right? And then if you're okay, I want to add a bird. What if you just drew the bird right on top of the guy? That's not a good idea. And so unless you're trying to make a statement of a lack of clarity, right? But in kind of the pop traditional genre of trying to get clarity, make that vocal pop out, make a gorgeous picture where you can see everything. We're not talking about deliberately blurring things. You probably want your subject and other things which you need. You need the trees, you need the hills, you need the birds, you need the sky, you need some other people, whatever. But they're not going to be on top of the vocal. And then this idea, so that's overlap, putting them literally in different places, on the keyboard, lower notes, higher notes. And you can, like I said, you can put things behind the subject. For example, you have your stick figure in the middle of your painting, and maybe you want a mountain behind them. Like that's a big opportunity, right? To put something behind them. And in audio, this is depth. Like we talk about achieving height, width, and depth. And as mixing engineers, we might think of depth as pushing something back with reverb and delays and coming forward with lack of dynamics with compression or brightening or whatever. But you can also do this with the arrangement. So if you have your, say around middle C on the keyboard, that's where your vocal is living. Sure, you could have guitar chords there, you could have strings or whatever, but you want to arrange those parts that are in the same area in such a way that it is deliberately behind it. And so there are ways to do this with like not having it draw attention to itself. So maybe it's holding a note instead of moving, right? But just being aware of this idea of like, where is the vocal with the notes or your lead instrument or whatever, and get everything else out of the way and think kind of notes first instead of like instruments first or sounds first. Like one thing I try to explain to people when I'm arranging a song for a client or whatever is like, for me, there's no guitar part. There's no piano part. I write all the notes first and then I decide which instruments play them. Like it's all about the notes. Like there's no just like, okay, I'm gonna play guitar. Okay, that was fun. Let me grab a bass and play some stuff. Like it's all the notes are written first, and then it's a matter of, okay, you play that note, you play that note. So everything is kind of organized with what pitches it's playing, so it's all out of the way of each other.
Now this is really interesting and fairly, I don't want to say obvious. This is an interesting perspective to look at something that is so logically understandable. But the question that I have for you is how much, like, I know this kind of goes away, but this becomes more automatic with practice and stuff. But how much of the forefront of your mind are you thinking about this during the actual creative process?
Yeah, so that's a great starting point for this idea of like art and craft, or craft and maybe intuition. And they always are working together. And I think the more you focus on craft, the more you're able to let go and just write intuitively. Like another way I'll explain this to people is I've focused on this idea of just arranging in general so much of voicing my piano chords in such a way that leaves room for this and getting these parts out of the way of that, and like really all the details and intricacies of this. I focus on this so much that for me, like if I sang Mary Had a Little Lamb, it's like, it's obviously as bad. Like that was out of tune. Anyone would know that unless you're tone deaf. It's like, that was bad. That was wrong. Like we know it's wrong. If someone's in the vocal booth, we would all like laugh. They were probably making a joke, whatever. For me, if someone plays their chord right here and the vocals right here, it's just as obviously wrong. It's like I hear it and it's like, oh my God, like get that out of the way, get that down there. And so this does take a lot of time, but I think the way you develop this sense of that intuitively being like kind of right or wrong as far as achieving the purpose you're trying to achieve, not that there's right or wrong in art, but there is making your art the way you want to or not. The way you get to that, I think, is by doubling down on craft and focusing on it, which is why I think it's a good exercise for songwriters, producers, arrangers to like really focus for like a month or two. Every single time there's a vocal, like pull up your piano and your DAW and like find where it is, and then deliberately make sure every single other part does not touch those notes. And if the vocal goes up, the arrangement gets out of the way as it goes up. And if it comes down for the verse or whatever, then the instrument's kind of the way that way as well. So just hyper focusing on it for a long time, I think will help it become more intuitive. And this is also why for me, so I do a lot of pen and paper work, even for pop stuff. Sometimes I'll do pen and paper. Sometimes it's just not like the way pop music should be made, but sometimes I do. And the nice thing about notated music is like you can write the vocal, and then if you're going to write another part, you're going to write it below it or above it. Probably. Like it's very obvious, like when you might make that mistake of putting things in the same range because you're looking at it. It's like a painting. Like I said with the stick figure, if you draw a bird right on top, it's really obvious that that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah. This is there's a lot of thoughts and branches of ideas that I want to kind of stem from this. But I also want to stay fairly focused. I feel like you have a lot of interesting thoughts and a good take as someone that is constantly composing, who's very theory minded. I think to get on the same page with all the listeners, let me state this first. I don't think. I think it's fair to say that, Gavin, you are very, very mindful about, not the proper, but mindful about theory. You understand, you've done a lot of studying, you have a keen interest for it. It's part of your personality where you're kind of like a freaky nerd about music and audio. It's very interesting to see. I see a lot of people online that have created excuses, and this is interesting because on a very normal level, like, it's pretty obvious that this is wrong. A lot of people write off theory, especially like pop producers and stuff. It's like, it's not that important. And it's interesting because there's always going to be anecdotes and reasons why you don't need theory. You know, even the entire genre existence of punk rock, where it's like, it's not meant to be too complicated. It kind of removes from the angsty teenage angry feeling if you make it overly complicated, potentially, right? And then there's other forms of punk rock where it does that beautifully. But so the first thing that I think we need to all, as listeners, need to get to understand on a baseline level, and this is true for mixing too, is that I think it is so very important to understand at least the baseline fundamental rules before you can break them. I think this goes beyond music. I think this goes beyond life theory as well. The reason why in Chinese culture they teach Confucianism first before they move into Taoism, because Confucianism is all about the rules and societal standards, and then that is a necessary part of the human sociology before moving into Taoism, which is breaking those rules and understanding what those are and what place those have, and then realizing how you can manipulate those to serve a higher purpose. But you don't know what that higher purpose is until you understand the original, the main intended purpose, kind of a vibe. To get everybody on the same page, I do believe, and I'm calling out mostly engineers for this as well. I don't think engineers really fully understand the importance of, at the baseline, oral skills. Like the recording engineer, and at the very, very minimum level, a recording engineer that can go into the studio and that can pick out a note on a keyboard that the vocalist is singing in the correct octave, I think are like actually very few to begin with. And then on top of that, understand at the very least major and minor chords enough where they can input the correct key into auto-tune. Right? I feel like that's like super basic aural skills. I don't even know if that's even theory at that point. Just listening and training and understanding music to a point that, and you could tell that the engineers in the industry that understand music at the technical level to a minimal degree tend to do significantly better as a service provider, as a communicator, which leads to as an engineer, right? Because I think those are fundamental to engineering, especially as a recording engineer, interacting with potentially very neurotic artists that are incapable of expressing themselves articulately, being able to communicate and understand intuitively, I think is really important. And especially to producers, obviously, this is kind of a lost cause. You need theory, I feel like, to kind of get to that next level of art. Gavin, so for you, learning theory as a personal interest for you, I feel like that comes fairly natural. You have a keen interest in it on a personal level. It aligns with you and your values. Beyond that, on a larger scale, what is, as someone that deeply understands theory and is lifelong progress to continue to understand it more, that values it highly, and as someone that is making a living from arranging, producing, scoring, I want to hear not my thoughts, but your thoughts on the value of theory within the pop world, and then as well as into composing world.
Yeah, well, I think the whole anti-theory thing, I really get it. And I think what they're feeling is very real, and I feel the same way, but I think they're kind of missing the mark a little bit, and I'll talk about that. The other thing I want to say is that theory and reading music aren't the same. Theory and what's taught in like Western culture, music universities doesn't have to be the same. All theory is a way to articulate what's happening. Like if you are a producer and you're like, I don't read music, I don't do theory, it ruins everything. All right, let's do the song. Okay, let's start from the chorus. If you say chorus, you're talking about form. Like you know theory. You have your own word for it. You're going to the chorus. This is form. If you say 1, 2, ready, go. You know the meter, you know. So I think a lot of people know theory and maybe their own version of it and use it all the time. But I think they have a bad taste in their mouth for this idea of someone teaching it to them, or I don't know what it is. Another one of my favorite.
Potentially, you think you're arguing it's potentially like an ego or a pride thing.
Could be. I think it could be more innocent than that. I think a lot of people, they feel a lot of mystique and mystery about how music comes and how it's made. And I think a lot of people get nervous that if they start to understand the inner workings of it, that it'll lose some of the magic. And I just want to say, as someone that's been studying theory since I was like 7 years old, the more you know, the more magical it is. Like we can't get to the bottom of some things. And so like, trust me, the magic will not go away. The what's the word? Like the personal, what's the word for this? Like the authenticity of your music is not going to be compromised by understanding theory. It's only going to be enhanced. And also, I think in some of these kind of anti-theory people, in their defense, there are a lot of people that go to music school, learn a couple things, and their music like sounds like music school. You know, there's something about that. I don't know why that is or what that is, but I get their frustrations with theory and their resistance to it. I just want to say, just do it however you want. Like, you don't have to read some 100-year-old orchestration textbook like I do. Like, you can do your own thing. Lots of people have different words for what these chords are. One of my favorite stories for this whole idea is Hans Zimmer is very famous for not reading music. Brilliant musician. He's managed to score, I don't know how many dozens, maybe over 100 movies. No one will, contest the fact.
He doesn't read music?
Does not read music. So he'll write in the DAW with all his sounds, and he'll play around and get the sounds, and then he'll send the MIDI to an orchestrator who will make sense of it. And we could that's the whole thing too. What is an orchestrator? What is a composer? But he has found a way to do all his work without knowing how to read music. But he still understands theory in his own way. There's some story of this guy who worked for Hans, was like an intern or something, and he was like Berkeley grad, super nerdy theory person, kind of like me. And so he went into Hans' studio, and they were co-writing. They were writing this thing together. And somehow it became important at one point to say what they were doing and not just do it. And so the Berkeley guy was like, oh, so we're doing a Lydian dominant thing. And then Hans was like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what Lydian dominant is. So the Berkeley guy plays the Lydian dominant scale, and Hans goes, oh, the cartoon scale. And he wasn't saying that, he wasn't trying to be funny. Like, that's what he calls it. He knows what that is. He knows that sound, and he just calls it this. And so I call it whatever you want. If you want to call this the happy chord and this the sad chord instead of what some people in textbooks call it, who cares? Like, there's no name for the sounds. I think it is important to understand the tradition, the history of theory, like kind of the lingua franca of theory, only because it's the easiest way to collaborate, because we've all decided this is what this is called. It's like if you decided, I don't want to learn English, I just want to make my own sounds and make my own noises. That's cool, but in a society where you need to communicate with other people, having the same language is really helpful. So in real life, like, if you want to be a musician, I know touring musicians that don't read music, and that's fine. But if you want to be in a band on a TV show where you're sight reading half the time, you have to read, And so there's just different ways that theory can fit into your life. But I think this idea of theory in general ever being bad is really silly and it's putting theory in a box of what it is. Because theory is just labeling. Theory is just saying, like, if you start a band, you want to be able to say, like, hey, we're doing this. Hey, we're doing this. You don't even have to call it A major. You could call it, like, second lowest string, open fret is the A. You can, just like guitar tab versus notation. I don't care what you call it, but I think it is very important to have some sort of language so that you can collaborate with other people. One, and two, probably biggest for me, the reason why I'm so obsessed with it and like the sort of more traditional way of learning theory is I'm just so grateful for everyone before me. I'm just like, standing on the shoulders of giants, crawling up to their shoulders, really. I'm just so grateful for this whole lineage. I just love this music so much. I love everything that's come before me, and I'm so grateful for it that I just want to, that's like the way I appreciate it, is like looking at it and trying to understand it. Like, I'm so grateful, for example, John Williams, obviously so grateful for everything John Williams has done, that he has made, as Spielberg said in that acceptance speech, he made broomsticks fly. He did that for like the whole global community. He made magic real for us. And I love that so much. And I'm so grateful for John Williams and what he's did that I just feel so compelled to look at it and understand it. And so that's the only reason I've kind of taken a more formal approach to understanding theory. But theory, all it is just language.
Yeah, I usually kind of like fixate on ideas for a while and let things ruminate and ponder them for a while before I kind of have an opinion on them. And recently, the idea that I've been having is something that you're kind of referring to. First off, I think it's like beautiful that you honor music in that way. Like, I think that's amazing. And I think more people should be thinking about it like that. But the lingua franca, the language and the common denominator that we can all use, I think maybe my argument may be what people have, and this can go into politics, this can go into philosophy, this can go into any part of human nature, I feel like. I don't think people realize fully that how powerful of a tool articulation is. Like, it's crazy that there's probably not as many bad ideas in this world as people realize, or like people that are like genuinely to the core dumb as they are inarticulate. Like, I think any idea can be showcased as a good idea if you are articulate. And when it comes to theory and creating and agreeing to, on a societal level, the language that we use, right?
I lost you. I don't know if you can hear me.
What it does is it can open the door to better comprehension and articulation of the one language that is true to music in any art form, which is emotion. And maybe that is the difference of, like, for example, like with pop music, the way that I kind of like in a dumbed down way, I don't like pop music that sounds like you're trying too hard. Like, that is the immediate sound. I don't know quite exactly how to describe it, but it is very obvious to even the non-trained ear. You sound like a try-hard. You sound like you're trying to be Bruno Mars, except Bruno Mars does it better. And so it's like, it's really interesting. And then you have complete weirdos that go way against the grain, that introduces a new perspective on this old notion of anger or this happiness in a way that's like, or honesty and or maybe even integrity or even vulnerability in a way that tickles your brain in a way from an angle that nobody has ever tickled before. That sounds kind of creepy, but it's all using the same language, but with different articulation. And so for me, in my mind, learning how to articulate better can only help you, is kind of the idea, even beyond music. And I'm kind of putting this thinking that I have right now over what we're talking about right now. But I want to move into from an engineering perspective, because you do also a lot of recording at home. And you have the space to record like chamber orchestra, small 5, whatever, people like little, I don't know what they call them. Quintets, quartets.
Yeah, whatever, yeah.
Sure. The string groups, horn groups, flute, woodwind groups, drums, full live bands and stuff. From an engineering perspective, what are some things that people should be keeping in mind when recording acoustic instruments?
Yeah. a lot of things, and a lot of things I didn't discover until very recently. Like I said, I'm always learning. I think, like a lot of us in this industry, say you're a mixing engineer and someone's like, oh, show me your work. And it just so happens to be that the last thing you mixed that's been released was like 6 months ago. And you're like, oh, shoot, that was 6 months ago, me. I was doing this. I was cranking up Gold Foss to 50% back then. And oh my gosh. Every single day we're like embarrassed by what we did the day before. So I'm the same way with recording. But some things that have really helped me are, one, I think it's really helpful to know a little bit about the instrument you're recording. So if you take an acoustic guitar, I think it's good to know. You don't have to be a super nerd, but it's good to know a little bit about toned woods. It's good to know what spruce sounds like compared to mahogany. It's good to know how the body size of the guitar will affect it, the scale length, the kind of bracing that is used, what kind of strings. It's good to know like some of the fundamentals of, like, you can look at a guitar and be like, oh, it's probably this. Of course, use your ear, I get it. But like, it's good to know what you're looking at and what it's probably going to give you. You can also look up radiation patterns of different instruments online and see graphs. For example, you can look up like violin radiation pattern. So this is a really fascinating thing because the frequencies that a violin might represent, so they play, the lowest one on a violin is a G. So you think of A 220, so it's like, 200 hertz? And then all the way up to 20 hertz between all the noise and things that's part of the sound. So from 200 to 20K plus, you have all this sound coming out of a violin. But it doesn't all come out in the same direction. Like 1K to 5K shoots this way, 200 to 400 shoots this way, 500, 800 shoots behind you. I'm making this part up, but like they all radiate in different ways, both vertically and horizontally. The sound shoots in different ways. And so some people will be like, okay, let's get out the acoustic guitar and let's figure out the right mic. But there's so much power in moving that mic around and finding where it fits best. And I think having some of the knowledge of like, oh, I know violins are really bright. They shoot out a lot of brightness this way and they shoot out a lot of body this way. So if you're listening, you're like, oh, it sounds really thin and abrasive. Well, let's move it towards the more body heavy part of the capture or vice versa. It's good to know some of the technique. So you're not just blindly like, well, let's try this. Let me go back to the booth and listen. Let's try this. You can kind of be like, oh, it's dark. Let's do this. Oh, it's bright. Let's do this. So you look up those radiation patterns is really helpful. Or also, I've done this a lot. Just like if you ever have like 2 or 3 hours and you have an acoustic guitar and a mic, just like move it around. Like find all the wrong positions that don't sound good. Just so you know what moving it that direction will do. So if you get into the booth and the way somebody plays or the guitar they're playing on in your kind of golden position, like at the joint 12 inches away like everybody does, if that's not working because it's X, Y, or Z, you know where to move it instead of like, oh shoot, it's not working. Let me spend 30 minutes and try a bunch of stuff. It's good to kind of know moving it left does this, moving it right does this. And the other thing I'll say is you're going to be kind of blind about what kind of the North Star is unless you have some good references or you just spend a lot of time in the genre. And so this is where I would really reference genres that are like really specialized in capturing those instruments. We'll get into this more, especially when mixing comes in regard to recording instruments, acoustic instruments and mixing them. If you like the standard of a string sounds, like a string recording and the mix of strings in pop music versus classical music is just so low. It's just so low. Just because the people that are doing pop music don't do strings every single day. Like in the past 70 years, in the mixing, producing world, we've made so many advances by mid-side and clippers and side chaining and like all this fancy stuff to just get the biggest, gnarliest, most impressive, amazing sounding records. And we're getting them. I mean, they sound, if you listen to anything from like a big artist in the past 5 years, maybe it's not your cup of tea, but like they're just getting, in general, just more and more impressive and gnarly and huge. Meanwhile, while everyone's like, I got this like 40th version of the 1176 that does this. Meanwhile, all the people in the classical world were just holding their mic and moving it 1 inch, 1 inch, 1 inch for 70 years straight. So they have like really locked in where to put microphones and how to get a good string sound, because that's all they have done for 70, 100 years or whatever. And so I would really recommend going to, and we can talk more about this, about what I would listen to, but try and pull up some like fancy pants acoustic guitar guy. Even if you're doing a pop song, listen to their acoustic guitar and try and use that as your North Star as you're trying to get a great acoustic guitar sound, because acoustic guitar...
Like good references.
Yeah. The acoustic guitar on like a pop record, just because it's not the priority, it's like all the vocal and stuff, right? It's just not going to be as glorious as it might be in other contexts. And glorious recordings isn't always the move, but those are good to like introduce into your vocabulary as you're trying to find and determine what is a good violin sound, what is a good guitar sound.
Yeah. This, first off, I just looked up radiation patterns for different instruments. Super useful. I didn't realize that was a thing. Never really noticed that. Way cool. I want to ask you the practicality of it all. As someone that is constantly, intentionally making different decisions from a pretty thoughtful level. Yeah, let's say you have a violin player, right? And you're relatively aware of the radiation patterns. Let's say there's a violin player that you worked with a lot, with the same exact violin that you've recorded multiple times in the same room, studio, microphone, preamp that you've recorded a bunch of times, right? You are fairly understanding of how to move the mic, the different polar patterns from an engineering perspective. Okay, how do we get different, more body, less top end or whatnot? What part of your brain is activated when determining how to record? Like when and how do you determine if you want the darker violin versus the brighter violin from a creative perspective? Like, is that the producer side of you? Is that the engineering side of you? And like, what dictates those decisions?
Yeah, definitely both the kind of producer, arranger, and the engineer side working together. But I will say one thing that's a huge part of this conversation is there is a lot of foresight to be had knowing what you will inevitably be doing on the back end once you had that recording anyway. Kind of like, I'm a huge fan of comping vocals with auto-tune on, because I do not want to choose a take because it's in tune. I'm going to tune it anyway. I'm going to put in a Melodyne and put everything in tune. And so I don't want to be swayed by like, oh, take 4 is like perfectly in tune, take 5, it wasn't in tune. But maybe take 5 was glorious. It was just like 20 cents flat on the money note. So I'll always comp with auto-tune on, so I'm listening to the important things because I will tune it later. Same with recording a violin. So in the world that I live in, which isn't everybody's world, very often, like you said when you read that text I sent you a couple weeks ago, I'm going to close mic a violin because of noise floor issues and other things, that the kind of humble space that I'm in, it's not big enough to be that far away or whatever. And so I'm going to close mic the violin, and the violin will never sound good close mic'd. Period. There's nothing you can do. You can learn, all you can about where to put it and give it your best shot. But I'm going to be EQing that violin like crazy anyway. I'm going to be pulling out sometimes like kind of 2 to 5K. I'll be pulling out 5 dB. Back in the day, before I really knew what I was doing about where to put a mic, I would pull out 10 dB sometimes of 2 to 5K, and I knew that. And so, like, there's something to be said about like maybe this spot sounds best on the violin and is going to minimize the need for that huge upper mid-range cut, but it's so far away or it's like behind the player, like on the floor doing something funky, then now the noise floor is an issue because I know I'm going to stack 10 of these violins together. And so you have to have the foresight of like, maybe this sounds worse, but the noise floor is more important in the end. Or maybe it sounds a certain way, but because of what I'm going to do later, this is the right move right now. So there are a couple engineering things I will do to help. This is particularly for strings. Acoustic guitars, like we know the sound of a close mic acoustic guitar, and that is like the sound very often. But you're not trying to make it sound like a classical guitarist in a recital hall. That is like not the vibe for a country song, But for strings, we always kind of want the room main pair sound. And so there's a couple funny plugins I use. There's one called Room Widener.
So I want to go back to that. You always want the sound of a room main pair sound. So like
always,
like a little bit more distance further back not so in your face.
Mm-hmm.
Is that kind of what you mean? So you want it to feel like it's further back.
But I might mic it up close anyway because of like noise floor issues and things.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's great to do a wide main pair of mics if you're recording a 100-piece orchestra because there's lots of volume. But if you're going to back away 20, 30, 40 feet from a violin and it's a solo violinist and you're stacking them 20 times to make them sound like an ensemble, your noise floor is going to be insane. So you have to get up close to mitigate some of those issues. And also there's something to be said about even the way we mic orchestras now, particularly in the film world, in the classical world too, but particularly in the film world where they're less concerned about like capturing the hall like it's a performance, but they're trying to just get the most glorious, amazing orchestral sound. There's close mics in there too that they'll use so they can kind of get the best of both worlds. And so I'll close mic a violin because there's something to be said about that. Also the noise floor issue. But I know later on, once I'm back in Logic and mixing it, I'm going to be trying to make it sound like it was recorded with a main pair and do all sorts of funny things, which will change the timbre of it, which will, not just the space, but the tone's going to change once you start putting these reverbs on. So you kind of have to have that in mind while you're miking.
Interesting. So to kind of dumb it down a little bit, a lot of your thought in the moment is kind of predetermined based on the direction that you know you want. So it's kind of like, I know what I want, and thus I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
Which I think to generalize to mixing in general, I think that's the big difference between an advanced experienced mixer and a mixer that is kind of new, is that mixers new will kind of use the tools to figure out where they can go. Where like experienced mixers already have an idea and a vision of where it can go, and they use the tools to get to a predetermined destination. And it seems like that's sort of the same logic as well when deciding how to mic things, and including things that we've talked about before, like arrangement, even the instruments used, potentially the players used, potentially even the mics used, right?
Yeah.
Using those tools and techniques that you've learned to further articulate the concept that this idea that you already have. It kind of builds a stronger idea from a foundational point. It feels very intentional.
It's very similar to mixing without soloing stuff too much, right?
Tell me about that. Yeah. What do you mean?
Like, okay, so I watched this video of Ali mixing something a couple of years ago. And it was hip hop, of course, right? And so he was doing drums. And I think he was soloing the drums together. But he was pointing out, like the snare drum sounded like, and it was kind of trappy. So the snare drum didn't have the high end that we kind of associate with trap. I mean, it was in the ballpark, but it probably could have used a 2-3B little lift to give it that little sizzle. But he pointed out, he's like, every single time in this song, every single time the snare hits, there's a hi-hat at the same time. And the hi-hat is the high end. And so he's not going to turn up the high end of the snare and like solo it and make it sound impressive on its own, because that snare and the hi-hat will always play at the same time. And so since they're at the same time, they're both percussion, they become a cohesive sound. So the hi-hat is the high end of the snare. If you were soloing the snare, you might boost that high end to make it sound like cool. And this is also, I think, part of the problem with the splice world is most of these samples sound glorious on their own, but maybe they don't fit into the mix well, they don't fit into the arrangement well. Like maybe your snare drum just has all this low end and this high end and it's like amazing. And sure, if you turn off solo, but all you're listening to is the snare drum, it'll still sound amazing. But if you start listening to the song, you're like, oh, now these guitars sound weak in comparison and blah, blah, blah. And so kind of the same reason why people will say be careful about using the solo button. I think people probably scare you from using it more than they should. I think the solo button's really helpful. But the ethos behind that is the same of like having the end game in mind when you're miking something. Like you don't always want the most just glorious fat acoustic guitar sound, because maybe it's like a big like Coldplay song. The acoustic guitar is basically, a tonal shaker. And so you don't want that big old beefy, glorious sound. You want this kind of thin, bright, shakery sound to begin with. But if you're just like, okay, it's acoustic guitar day, let's turn the track down 20 dB and listen to the acoustic guitar and get it to sound glorious, that might not be the best thing in the end. So just having like the end game in mind as you're miking something up, I think is really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go into the two things that you were talking about as well as we come towards the end of this episode here. You talked about panning tools and early reflection or reverbs tools. Well, hold on. Before we get into that, I have a perfect anecdotal example of what you just said. Last 2 weeks ago, I mixed a alternative rock song for a new artist sent to me by management. They don't know who I am. There's no baseline trust. And I did a mix for them. And revision 1, both the A&R and the manager are like, oh my gosh, like, I think it's actually perfect. Like, they were like, they like didn't want to say it, but they're like, I think this is actually it. And that there was 2 guitars. There was the electric guitar and then playing chords in doubled wide. And then there was an acoustic guitar that was also the same thing, doubled wide. And they would almost always play at the same time. And if you muted one, it would become a less cohesive instrument. And it was like the acoustic guitar was playing like that, what you talked about, like the Coldplay tonal shaker. It was adding the top end of the electric guitar. Like, if you weren't paying attention, if you didn't know better, you wouldn't realize that there were 2 guitars, like 2 different types, acoustic and electric. And so I was using like the low mids, like the girth, the body of this distorted electric guitar. And then instead of like using the top end of that electric guitar, which can be really hissy, especially like 3 to 6K, it can be like really nasally and weird. I kind of emphasized that with the acoustic guitar, which kind of the demo was hinting at as well. I think that's fair to say as well. Like they kind of intended to do that. Maybe, I don't know how intentional it was, but I did that more intentionally and thoughtfully. And I just found that that's like the perfect example of creating one cohesive instrument from 2 separate instruments that are playing at the same time. Just very cool. Anyway, going into the idea of, we talked about upper mid-range management, kind of displacing or replacing frequencies in the upper mid-range and emphasizing more of the lower mids or even airband stuff potentially, and kind of moving frequencies around to build clarity. You even talked about arrangement and notes, starting with notes, right? Let's talk about panning and early reflection with reverbs.
Yeah, this is a huge thing. As part as getting a convincing main room sound when you're close miking something, right? You're trying to trick people. So like in my world, I do a lot of live strings where people don't have the budget to hire a full live string orchestra, 40 players, all making $100 an hour or whatever. So they do some sort of trickery where we will record soloists and kind of stack them. My violinist has like 7 violins. They do a different violin each take. There's a whole bunch of trickery to that. And in the end, I have like 40 close mic strings, and I'm trying to make it sound as if it was in one big room with 2 mics only, picking up the whole thing. So that's what this all is.
So I want to ask you, so we've talked on the show previously about if you're going to do, especially with horns and strings, close mic'd, when you do different takes, the trickery behind that, especially because of phase and stuff, perfect. Different instruments, different distances, different locations, different players if possible, just changing it up with each stack. I love that your violin player that you stack has 7 different instruments. That's so fun. Well, let's go back to why is that big room sound important? Like what emotional aspect does that add? Like why doesn't just dry? And I think there is kind of an answer to this potentially. Yeah. But why doesn't it work to not do that? Like why doesn't it work just keeping the close mics as it is?
Well, I guess what I'll say is, to play devil's advocate, maybe it is fine and it's a vibe, like it's a thing. And in the film,
when done intentionally.
Sure.
When done intentionally.
Not just like, oh, my strings, like this is the problem with pop stuff is even the pop world, unless you're like Taylor Swift, people still don't have huge budgets. So doing a real live string ensemble, even though strings are really in vogue right now, people still don't have the budget for that. There's still usually some stacking kind of trickery. So you might, as a mixing engineer, work with a big label artist and you have all these strings and you might not listen to strings every day. And so you hit all those strings, you're like, oh, this is amazing. I love strings and they're live. This is cool. But you don't realize like that's not how strings are supposed to sound. And that's probably not what the artist wants. That's probably not what the arranger wants. So the room sound, I don't know how else to say it. It's just like the sound of strings. I mean, there's no world in reality in which 40 people could all be close mic'd in a vocal booth. You know, that's not the sound of 40 plus players. So the real convincing sound of all those players is in a bigger space and mic'd from far away, kind of out of necessity because of how many people are there in the size of the room. But yeah, as you back away, the mics, you'll get less high end and you'll get more roundness, more sort of lushness. And so these are all things that I'm really aiming for, even with close mic'd strings, is I'm trying to soften them up, round them up, so that they have the tonality of being mic'd from far away, which again, like, this is kind of philosophical, so I don't know, but it's like, that's just the sound of strings, period. That's just like the sound. And if you want to break that, awesome. But that, like, room mic, that's just the sound. Every movie you've ever heard, any old record that had full strings that was actually a real ensemble, that is the sound. If you want to break that, go for it. I'm all for it. People do that.
Yeah, like an ensemble mic'd far away sounds darker, warmer, and the room ambiance as well makes it sound live and real. Almost romantic, depending on how it is. But there's lots of different adjectives that we can use to portray the emotional part of it. So my point was, like, there is and then you're talking about the legacy sound of ensembles. But I'm even thinking from a brittle close mic violin that without any reverb is not unusable, but is at least, at the very least, like, not typical, because it kind of removes the typical intention of the emotional intention of a violin, which is meant to be more romantic, intimate, open, or like carrying, soft, not like a very bright soprano player a singer that's right in front of your face, but like a descant singer that's in the back of the orchestra that's embellishing and not necessarily in the forefront like a soloist. So I do think this as well, like, even with pop music, adding room verb to the entire drum kit does a lot. It changes the sound stage, even for hip hop music, something that you wouldn't even use that for, can change the sound stage a lot. And I'm trying to, now that I'm saying it out loud, it's difficult to articulate why, but I do think, in comparison to complete and total dryness, a little bit of short room reverbs. And I think what you're going to talk about too is like reflections and early reflections, which I want to dive a little bit deeper into, can totally change and make the drums more realistic, like relatable in an emotional way.
Yeah, realistic, I think, is the key word. Again, if you don't want to be realistic, like, have at it. I'm all for that. I'm all for shoving a drum kit in a kind of oversized vocal booth and putting nothing. Like, that's a vibe. That's cool. But if naturalness is what you're going for, realism is what you're going for, I mean, there's real space in the universe. So, like, we want to show some of that. Another thing I thought of in this conversation is Bruce Swedien talked about in his book that he wrote like in the 90s or something. I think he would like go and see the orchestra. This is probably in LA. Maybe it was the LA Phil. I don't know. Once a month. He loved music. He loved classical music, but he did it as a way to acclimate his ears to real life music. Because if you sit in front of speakers all the time, that becomes your reality. Just like, I think this is why I think, mix references in general are really important. If you listen to a really bad mix for 4 hours straight, all of a sudden that is the default, and like that is normal music. And so if all your mix references and all your projects sound really bad, it's always, you're going to keep making bad stuff because that's what you think music is. So Bruce Swedien would go to the orchestra, like live orchestra in a concert hall once a month to sort of acclimate his ears to like, oh, this is real music. This is what the left sounds like. This is what the right sounds like. And he'd close his eyes and maybe pretend he's in speakers, like, how do I preserve this? How do I bring this and get this out of the speakers? And so I think, because it's probably fair to say that most people in our generation that aren't classical musicians aren't going to see the orchestra very regularly. They don't understand what these instruments sound like. They might know guitars, they might know drums, but a lot of these people don't know what an orchestra sounds like because they're not going to the orchestra and they're not even listening to classical music anyway, or music that's using, these instruments. And so they just have no idea. So they hear strings for the first time. They're like, whoa, this is awesome. These are strings. But I think you need to acclimate yourself to the real sound. And if you don't have the means or whatever to go to the symphony very often, just listen to classical music a little bit. Just like, once a day, like listen to 5 minutes of something like, oh, and then over, a couple weeks, couple months, you'll start to be like, oh, this is what that sound is. And then you'll get screechy, close mic'd strings in your session one day and you're like, this is disgusting. Let me change this. So yeah, I'll go into some of the things I use to get that sound when I'm close micing, plugin specific. So the first thing I'll do is I'll EQ things pretty heavily. If with strings in particular, the upper mid range usually has to go quite a bit. And I'm always recording with ribbon mics, and the ribbon mics I use this is small brand called Masonovic, and they're kind of like hi-fi ribbons. So they're not vibey ribbons. They're smooth ribbons, but like ultra modern and a clean, extensive top end. But they're still ribbons. But even it's not enough. They're still so brittle. And I'm trying to put the mic in the right spot. You pull it in, it's still that kind of 2 to 5K thing is just too much. So I'll usually carve that out. You can go overboard, but I really encourage mixing engineers that don't do strings a lot to try and go overboard first. Like pull that upper mid range way down, and be listening to stuff so you're not like going crazy, but like get used to that sound of this upper mid range just being way tamed out because it probably needs it. Violins were not made to be close mic, particularly violins. Lower strings, cello, and viola, way less so. They need way less work, but violins, that upper mid range is crazy, needs a lot of help. So I'll try and EQ it first. And I'll usually try and do this if I'm stacking, if I'm like doing 10 violin takes to make a fake section, I'll try and put it on the bus. It's probably more natural to do it that way, less CPU, whatever. But I'll EQ it, try and get it in the ballpark. And then there's this magic plugin I used called Panbox. This is by JD Factory. It's this guy, Joel, who is a mixing engineer for orchestral stuff. He's younger, and he has a little company. He has like 3 plugins, and they're very niche, like to this world. Although, I'll say why I think they're kind of cool in general. And it's a panning plugin. So it's like, why should I pay for this in the first place? They're not, it's not expensive.
I pulled it up right now. Yeah.
So like $20-$30 or something?
Yeah, 60 euros.
60 euros. Oh, that's more than I thought. But the thing with Panbox, you have to remember, what is panning in real life? Panning is turning one speaker down and turning one speaker up. That's all it is. If you are in a real space and you move somebody from left to right, it's a lot more complicated than just the levels of the left and right changing. If someone moves to, say you have a pair of mics, and you put someone dead in the center, somehow they're perfectly phased in the center, so you're hearing it like in mono in your speakers. As they move left, it doesn't just get louder in your left and quieter in the right, it gets brighter in the left and darker in the right. So there's tonal things that happen when you move from left to right in a main pair. So the panning that we all use is kind of unrealistic because it's just balanced. But that's why we can get ultra wide, kind of unrealistic in a good way sounds. And I'm all for that too. I hard pan stuff all the time. But this Panbox thing is a way to move something in a natural way where it's not just doing levels, but it's also doing what would happen tonally in real life if someone would move from left to right. And so I've just found that
I'm looking at it right now. Yeah. With total tonal pan, smart pan, balance, Haas pan. Interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so I will usually put that. So say I have 6 first violins that are that comprise of the first violin section. So I will put it on all 6 of those and then pan at like 1 100 left, 1 at 95 left, 1 at 90 left, and so on. And so it's like they're kind of filling out that left section in a natural way, but also, all those violin players would be different amounts of left. And so I'll do that by panning all of them individually with this Panbox thing, which kind of does a more realistic panning. And then another plugin from this guy, Joel, is Room Widener. And I don't know what he's doing, but somehow it pushes things back without adding any sense of reverb. It just pushes it back. So there's probably some tonal things happening as well as some kind of almost unhearable, indetectable early reflections. It just kind of pushes it back. And so this is great at getting, taking that close mic sound and pretending it's a main pair sound. It's a room mic sound just by pushing it back.
That one's 35 euros as well. Same company, JD Factory.
And that also does something to the composite imaging. It kind of spreads it around too. So if I put that on my first violins bus after I've panned them, it also makes that kind of panning even more wishy-washy and realistic instead of like, here's the first violin, here's the second violin. Because when you mic people, from 20 feet away, you can't hear that's where that person's sitting, that's where that person is sitting. They're just kind of like over there to the left. So there's something about that room widener plugin that also helps make that imaging more realistic. But the main thing is it pushes it back. And then after room widener, I will use a reverb to like really, really put it in a space. And here it's really important to have a reverb, I think, that has like a dedicated early reflections half and then a dedicated reverb or tail half. Because what the early reflections are what's going to place it in a real space. And it's like, how far away are we? What is the nature of that space? How reflective is it, or how diffused is it? And how far away are we from the source? The one I like to use, I use Cinematic Rooms from Liquid Sonics. These are the same guys that make Seventh Heaven. Seventh Heaven has early reflections in its algorithm as well, of course. But Cinematic Rooms is particularly realistic sounding. I'll use Seventh Heaven a lot if I want like a more kind of indulgent sound. Think of like a solo cello in a song, where I'm not necessarily going for realism. I'm just trying to make this romantic, glorious cello. I'll use Seventh Heaven for...
and these are both fairly high-end, more expensive
yes,
reverb plugins as well.
True.
It's not your vintage Valhalla.
True. Which I love. But yeah, you put vintage verb on your strings, you're making a really bad choice. Unless it's like disco. Because I mean, even those 70s records, they were doing that too. Like they were throwing wacky plates on their strings. So that's a thing. But
hold on, Gavin. I'm getting to the point. I need to use the bathroom so bad it's starting to get distracting. Can we take a pause for a second?
Yeah.
I'm gonna do a clap.
Okay.
I'll be right
I'm gonna go potty too.
I need to pee so bad. Sorry, dude.
Are you good? I had to go too.
I was like, hold on. I can't. I'm actually starting to get like distracted. All right,
good.
let's continue on from the reverb bit.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for strings, usually my first two things are going to be Seventh Heaven or Cinematic Rooms. In a general, Cinematic Rooms, if I'm really trying to make it sound as real as possible, and Seventh Heaven for a slightly more indulgent sound. I mean, much more realistic than like Valhalla. Valhalla is like pixie dust. It's like magic. But Seventh Heaven is definitely like one notch more realistic, and Cinematic Rooms really is a lot more realistic to me. A lot of people love like Altiverb and other convolution reverbs for this. I just don't have those, but Cinematic Rooms is my go-to for that. And another thing, because I know like almost everybody owns Seventh Heaven that's working professionally. If you don't know already, the Seventh Heaven Algorithms 1 and Algorithms 2, like how there's Halls 1, Halls 2, Rooms 1, Rooms 2, are fundamentally different, which I think is important to know. Rooms 1, Halls 1, all the Algorithm 1 reverbs have a less modulated tail, so they're slightly more realistic in their imaging, but the tail is kind of modulating and spreading around less. So they're great for things if you're trying to preserve transient. So they're great like reverbs for drums, for example, because the imaging is rock solid and stable. It's not kind of fluttering around. But the Algorithm 2 stuff, Rooms 2, Halls 2, has more modulation going on in the reverb. Not to the point of like a Valhalla thing, but it kind of has a little bit more pixie dust. And so it's great for things that aren't transient oriented, like strings, or like a vocal. So usually for like a solo cello, if it's just like a singer-songwriter song with just a solo cello, and I'm not necessarily going for ultimate realism, I'm going for like ultimate romance, like the way strings feel more than the way strings sound, like an impressionistic approach, as opposed to like photo accurate. I will usually go to Seventh Heaven Halls 2 for that like slightly more romantic modulated. It's very realistic, again, compared to like Valhalla and plates and stuff, but it has a little bit of magic around it. I use Halls, Large, and Stage a lot for solo cello, just to be specific. But
so
yeah, and then
I'm noticing for Seventh Heaven, there's like the regular version, and then there's the Pro version. Are you using the Pro version, or do
I
you
have Pro. I don't know if regular doesn't have Algorithm 2, and what separates the Pro.
I think they have the algorithms. I just don't see low frequency sculpting.
Yeah. There's some like
a
where you
few
can
other-
change which early reflection algorithms it's using. You can like EQ it more and stuff like that. Things frankly I don't really use that often, and I think the prices are very different, isn't it? Like 70 versus like 280.
Yeah, it's
something.
$300 versus $70. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you don't have it and you're trying to get on the Seventh Heaven train, the standard one might be totally fine. But yeah, Cinematic Rooms is cool because it has a left half of the plugin and the right half of the plugin. And the left half is all early reflections and the right half is all the reverb tail. So what I will usually do is, and you could dial in on like on a knob how much early reflections to tail you want. So usually what I'll do with dry strings after room widener, so there's already some pushback, I'll put Cinematic Rooms on and I'll go all the way to early reflections, and then I'll mess with the early reflections parameters, like the kind of EQ of it, and there's all these different things in there to try and get it to sound the way I want. And then I'll just dial that early reflections to tail thing to taste. And usually it's pretty early reflections dominant because there are really no early reflections in my dry recordings, and so they need a lot of early reflections more than tail. Very different from when you get recordings that were recorded in a big space. And this is why Cinematic Rooms is so helpful. There are other reverbs that have that early reflections tail slider or knob, but it's just what I know. So I recently, just last week, I recorded like 25 minutes of full orchestral music in Budapest. And so this is on a scoring stage. So I got all these files. This is insane, by the way. This one of the files was 770 tracks. It was like 25 gigs of audio. It's a nightmare to work with. But even then, the scoring stage, the main pair sounds glorious, and I don't need room widener. But I do usually want a little bit of extra reverb tail. This is very common, even in classical music, certainly in film music. They're on a glorious scoring stage that has that distant sound, but they're still adding more reverb to it, a little more plush, a little more tail. But what you want to be careful with is because you're already picking up reverb, you're already picking up that big room. It has all the early reflections, which will make it clear that the violins are there and the cellos are over there, and all that sort of realism is in the mics because you're in a big space. And so you don't want to smack a reverb on top of that is also trying to fake early reflections, because then you get a more muddled thing. So what's cool with Cinematic Rooms is you can do just the tail and have it put no early reflections into it, and you can put that on top of on top of a recording that is a big space that already has the early reflections baked into it, and you get a much more natural sound. It's like you preserve the scoring stage sound, then just add like a little bit more on top instead of like getting in there into the scoring stage and like adding stuff in there and messing it all up. It's kind of similar to pre-delay. It's a little more complicated than pre-delay, but it's kind of like leaving room for that initial thing and then adding stuff on top.
Beautiful. Amazing. Yeah, especially I don't think most people think about this too much. And to be quite frank, messing with early and late reflections and even like diffusion and other parameters that typically aren't messed with in reverb plugins, they're difficult to hear at first. Yeah. So it's like, I think at the very least, go ahead as a listener, go ahead and take the time to mess with those a little bit more and pay attention a little bit more to what those do, especially within the context that Gavin was talking about here. I kind of want to end the episode on two kind of ideas here. The first one is that, and I mean this in a hopeful way. Hip hop was on the rise and kind of even reigned supreme for many years. For a few years, it was kind of short-lived at the top. Like rock was long time dominant for like decades. True. Yeah, but then hip hop was like maybe not even a decade of like being at the top. But there's already and what I mean is financially, there's a fiscal decline in sales. Yeah. And so it's not as much as like cultural relevance as it is like people are just less interested in it financially speaking. And I find that very interesting. With the fear, not even the actual practical use of, the fear of AI as well. So many different factors, creatives right now, even in the video game and film space where like investors and like safe decisions trumping creativity in general. We're kind of moving back into this. I'm hoping that we're moving back into this space. And I think we're seeing some patterns of moving back into prioritizing creativity once more, because the stark contrast of creativity is getting pretty obvious. And I'm hoping that AI will kind of, and AI in whatever direction, cultural as well, outside of AI, we're seeing that contrast of like lack of creativity, more financially focused creative projects for like creativity for creative sakes projects. Regardless of me trying to isolate any variables here, we're seeing movements towards more money being invested into real instruments. We're seeing the rise of country. We're seeing the rise of alternative rock. The decline of hip hop doesn't mean that there's a decline of listeners of hip hop. It means that there's a change in values. I feel like there's still the same amount of listeners, if not more listeners, and people that are more open-minded to new genres with more history to rely on and more history to relate back to. But I hope that we continue. I'm seeing a trend right now. The point is, I'm seeing a trend right now where more real instruments, more real musicians are being used, and the general layman audience, the non-hyper-intellectual, just the general enjoyer of music, the general audience is leaning towards real acoustic instruments right now. And I'm hoping to, on a personal level, I'm hoping that creativity and that level of prioritizing musicality and intimacy on that level continues to move forward alongside more legacy hip-hop, trap that we're familiar with. And what that means is for engineers and for composers, the value of understanding acoustic spaces, miking, processing, mixing these real life instruments and enhancing realism is going to become more and more valuable of a skill, which I think will in turn to more potential income in the future. This is something that is worth investing into, something worth practicing to, and something that I've said on the podcast many times before is that starting in Utah, where it was a lot of singer-songwriter rock stuff at the beginning, and I've recorded tons and tons of live drums in the same space with different mics, with different drummers and drum kits in different areas of the room. There's like even with BYU, like having some experience recording full orchestras. Right? Those are some experiences I feel like that have led me to increase my skill in ways that other people unfortunately have not had the opportunity to, which which I think can be relatively correlated to the income and whatever success that you deem, right? Whatever it is, go out, and if you're going to intern, try to find a place that is kind of out of your comfort zone. Don't be afraid to work at a jazz studio or like some sort of cinematic scoring place. Don't be afraid of those things. If you're true to the core hip hop 808s guy, go to a rock studio to get some experience. Go to a jazz studio, get some experience. And take expand as an engineer. I think it is our collective responsibility and should be our collective priority to maintain this level of curiosity and expanding our repertoire of music and understanding how music can be articulated and intensify different and emulate different emotions. And you, the reason why I loved having you on the show, and I asked you to be on the show, Gavin, is because speaking personally as someone that has mixed your productions, I didn't mention too many of. I just mentioned you as a friend and someone that we've known for a long time. But yeah, you have. I didn't mention at the beginning. I should have. You have a ton of experience working with real orchestras, like hundreds of people. Like you just said, you just got back from Budapest. I saw your posts about that. Arranging for classical film score, exciting symphonic type trailer stuff, and then just regular ass pop music, both bland and intricate, and may I say, as someone not and obviously I'm a little bit biased, but I think people should, like, listening to this episode, should look you up. And I would dare people, I dare listeners of this episode to challenge your thoughts by listening to Gavin's music that he's produced, that he's recorded, because it is both on an intellectual and emotional level, highly connected with, and has a lot of practical empathy, I would say. You very well connect with the listener to the artist. It's intellectual, but it's still accessible, which I find that to be difficult as well. I think that you are genuinely, and I'm not trying to brown nose here, I genuinely think you are one of the more talented people that I've ever worked with. And so I should have started with that, because I think if people really understood how good you were at your job, the advice that you're giving, the thoughts that you're offering should be significantly more weighted and is incredibly insightful. So go check out Gavin on Instagram at Gavin McMahan, GavinMcMahan, and that's your website as well, gavinmcmahanmusic.com. The last thing that I want to ask you on a personal level, Gavin, is you, even in your Utah Valley Magazine article that I stalked you on at one point, you mentioned loving music to this day and having a deep personal connection to music still. I think it's fair to say that not everyone that kind of goes through this process of finding a career in music and pushing the borders so extremely, like pushing understanding to an extreme level, not everybody is able to maintain that level of what you kind of described in that article as companionship with music. That love and companionship from music. How have you been able to keep that level of love and passion for music, and how does it affect your current work today?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, thanks, man. That's a lot of stuff, a lot of love. I have a lot of thoughts about all this stuff. I'll try and answer that question, but I have so many thoughts I would love to share if we can in the last 2-3 minutes or whatever. You're right, a lot of working professionals in music talk about how as soon as this becomes your job, inevitably, maybe not permanently, but inevitably there will be days and there will be projects that don't feel like art, and they don't feel like whatever like your core music memories are when you listen to this album, when you saw this show and you saw this movie. It seems like it's not that same muscle anymore, and it seems like, oh, I'm like EQing, and the client said to turn the vocal 5 dB, and you're stuck in this, and it doesn't feel like art anymore, and it feels like work and industry and making content and like all these things that just kind of give you the yuck, and it feels like it's really, that's a very common thing. And I'm not going to pretend that that doesn't happen to me. I do think from the perspective I hear from other people, I feel like I experience that much less than other people. I think I learned early on, and by mistake, by making mistakes, I learned this lesson that there is always opportunity in your project to make it art and to make it real, and to to make this a real thing. I mean, people are dying, people are getting raped. There's crazy stuff going on, and here we are making this pop song about like something that feels so distant from that. And I just want to say all of that is part of this kind of human story that we're all a part of, and all these conversations are worth having. And I think just on a personal level for other people like us that are working, just remember there's always like a way to make it art and to make it good. Like, for example, in my world, I might be producing a song, so most of the time that means I'm doing like 99% of the arranging, but sometimes the client doesn't really let me, or they don't really want me to, or whatever, which I'm fine. The whole spectrum of self-production to here's a scratch vocal, see you in final vocals in 2 weeks. That whole spectrum is fine for me. But if someone's telling me to do things with the arrangement that I just really don't feel good about, and we don't have this sort of relationship where I can kind of push back, and it's just like, they told me to do this and I don't really. Well, what you can do is you can still make that shaker sound glorious. You can still make the vocal comping flawless. You can still get every mouth click out of the vocal. There's always somewhere in your project to achieve like maximum excellence. Even if you feel like there's this really important thing that you feel like you couldn't hit right, or maybe you don't even like the song. Maybe you're working on a song that you just don't like. Maybe like you're like kind of conflicted because you're like against it or something. But you can always, make that mix as amazing as possible. And even if they tell you to turn the vocal up 5 dB more than it should be, you can still make everything else sound glorious. You can make the imaging glorious. You can make the reverb glorious or whatever. So I think there's always room to make something excellent. And I think that's why I still really maintain a really deep love for it, even while working as a professional, is because I try on every project to make it truly art. I try to like always have some sense of pride in what I'm doing. I mean, so I'm downstairs in the basement at home studio, and upstairs like our kitchen and stuff, and we have a little home pod. And every single day I'll go upstairs and I'm stoked to play whatever I worked on that day and like stream it over to our home pod. Because I take so much pride in my work, even when it feels like it's not really my work and it's the client's work, and I feel like I can't really hit it the way I want to, but I still take pride in like, yeah, but listen to how good the bass sounds, listen to how good this sounds. And so there's always just so much love for that. I also think there's probably just some personal things in my life and the way I live my life that just make me just really grateful for this whole music thing. It's all very real to me still. I still listen to music that really affects me, that changes my life. I still, and this kind of ties back to the theory gratefulness thing I was saying, like, I listen to all this music and it changes me and it affects me. And so I love it and I'm grateful for it. And I just feel like I'm just participating in the music thing. It's sort of this like Western individualistic thing versus more of like an Eastern collectivist thing. I definitely feel like much more of a collectivist in general. I'm not a big American, like put my fence up. This is my card. This is my life. Give me my credits. This is my deals. Like, man, I'm on the ride with you guys, and I'm just so grateful. I'm so grateful to work on like the worst song ever, and this person that doesn't know what they're doing and they're being a jerk. I'm just like grateful to like be working with that person and be navigating the whole thing, and it's just all like a ride for me. I also want to really briefly go back to this idea of intellectual music or intellectual anything. In its place. I feel very, very passionately about this, as you might imagine. And I could talk about this. We need another couple hours to really get into it, but I'll try and sum it up quickly by saying, to this day, most people still think that Thriller is the best selling album of all time. It's hard to measure in the world of streaming, but we still probably think Thriller is the best selling album of all time. If it's not, if it's Blinding Lights or something, it's a very well selling album. It's a good album that a lot of people really liked. Michael Jackson was not some niche guy. It was a big deal. Thriller, the music is very sophisticated. The harmony, the chords, the string arrangements, the horns, everything is very sophisticated. And you know what no record executive ever said was like, these chords are too jazzy. It sounds like jazz. Nobody will like it. We need to square it off and make it more pop. We need to make it a pop album. It's too fancy, Quincy and Michael. Let's make it more pop. Nobody said that. Because it didn't matter. It was still the best-selling. It is the definition of pop. It's probably the best-selling album of all time. It is the most accessible. And so I just think that sophistication in music somehow being different from pop is not a thing. It is not a thing at all. There's a way to not be popular, to make try and make music where there's no key, or we're not even using the 12 tones that we use in Western music. There's ways to do that. And that is definitely not popular. But popular music and sophistication are not at odds at all. No, they play Thriller at kindergarten Halloween parties, and every kindergartner is getting down to it and dancing to it. It takes no know-how. I think the real issue is people getting into the studio and having a sort of cursory knowledge of music. They know a couple chords, and they know that, and they can hear those chords. And so as soon as they hear a chord or something that they don't understand, they say, oh, because I don't understand it, other people won't understand it. It's too fancy. It's too whatever. Let's go back to this. But that's just you, because you do know this and you don't know this. And it's hard for you to accept that there are things that you don't know and that are good. But the kindergartners are getting down to it. The tone deaf people are getting down to Thriller, which has augmented and diminished chords and modal interchange and secondary dominance and all this fancy stuff all over the place, and nobody listens to Thriller and is like, oh, it sounds too sophisticated. I'm just a pizza delivery guy. I'm not a jazz musician. I can't listen to Thriller. Everybody listens to Thriller. That is not sophistication in and of itself. But my point is sophistication is not at odds with popular music. And the reason why I'm so passionate about this is I think this sort of lack of sophistication is very tied to kind of social media, quick answers, easy fixes culture. It's people getting to the studio and pulling up a loop and a beat because it's fast and it's indulgent. This is kind of crass, and this is me modifying a Woody Allen quote, but it's musical masturbation is what it is. It's people just it's just all pleasure. Let me pull up cool sounds, turn it up, pull up the 808, just go nuts. And it's just so fast, and it freaks me out just as much as how it freaks me out that people will get all of their politics from social media, and they will watch a 5-minute clip on TikTok and say, these are good guys or bad guys, so politically I think this. It's the same phenomenon that is happening in music, where it's just quick. It's just these are the 3 chords I know, this is what we do, anything else. The audience has not gotten dumber since the 80s. We have not gotten back in the 80s, your regular pizza delivery guys were smart enough to appreciate Thriller. Now they're not. No, we still listen to Thriller every Halloween. The audience isn't any dumber. It's just the music creators, one, don't have the know-how, and so when they see the know-how, they're oh, that's fancy stuff. That's not me. Or maybe are too scared or something. I don't know what it is, but I definitely think sophistication and an intellectual approach to music has nothing to do with alienating listeners or accessibility or anything like that. It could, sure, just as pop music could. I could pull up an 808 and make people upset too. I can play 3 chords and make people upset by just making it so bad somehow, right? You can challenge your listener, but it has nothing to do with the sophistication part. And I just think we're doing such a disservice to humanity right now by feeding humanity just smaller, simpler things. And I love small and simple stuff too, to be clear. I do a lot of singer-songwriter stuff that is, the 3 chords and the truth. I'm a huge believer in that. That is simple ideas. It's simple music for simple ideas and simple feelings. And also shout out to all my, splice friends out there that are using 3 chords but are using fancy sounds. That's poetic too, because it's like, it's a simple idea, a simple feeling, but for some reason it doesn't feel simple, and so I'm expressing it in a little more complicated way, and so you have weird, wacky sounds, but simple kind of music DNA. I love all of it. All of it is fair game to me. But I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of our human experience is much more complex and nuanced and much less like good guys, bad guys. And it's such a disservice to humanity to keep putting out music that makes it seem like everything is simple and fast when most ideas and feelings are much more complicated and nuanced, and they require a vocabulary that is equally complex and complicated to express that. We just saw this musical, which I won't name because I don't want to throw it under the bus, but there's this brutal scene in which this father-in-law kills the baby of his son and daughter-in-law. And it was in a major key, and it ended on a major chord, and it never left the key. There was no sense of I don't know what's the word, conflict or unsettledness. It was just and I killed the baby and it's over, jazz hands. And that's I think that was just a really bad choice. But we're seeing this a lot in our music where we're packaging up these really complicated ideas, and politically as well, and packaging them to a really simple thing. So it's if you don't vote this way, you're good or bad. And the music that I think a lot of us are making is feeding into that cycle by virtue of the fact of us saying, this is not accessible, it's too complicated. And it's well, life is complicated. And people can listen to it. People can listen to Thriller. And anyways, I'm very, very passionate about that. And I think, and I hope anyone listening to this, that's a producer or a songwriter or engineer out there, never feels like something that is more complex or nuanced or something is making the music less accessible, because Thriller, and two, maybe accessible isn't always the most important thing. Accessibility is important, but again, Thriller. So,
yeah, very well articulated. I was totally engaged the entire time. Just I think that's amazing. I think a couple things is the optimism that I can jump on and endorse is the idea people aren't getting dumber. Contrary to popular beliefs, people aren't getting dumber. If anything, people are getting smarter. And they do think that that's more practical to live your life more optimistically rather than thinking that Armageddon is just days away. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that religiously, but not to minimize that, but yeah, no, I do think that that's very well said, well spoken, and there's a lot of good examples and bad examples that I could say as well, but I don't want to call people out. I mean, the classic one is some of the older Jacob Collier stuff. Mm-hmm. People don't realize that at the end of the game, even with right now with video games, with writing in video games, capitalism is starting to finally kind of work again, in the sense that enough people are realizing that these video games that are coming out recently just aren't written well and are prioritizing other things outside of what was originally the main purpose of the video game, which was fun. Mm-hmm. Thriller is undoubtedly fun. Mm-hmm. It's catchy, it's repeatable, you can sing along with it. So the sophistication doesn't get in the way. It's not self-indulgent, mm-hmm. and the crass way that you say it's not theory masturbation, musical masturbation. Yeah. Whereas some of the older Jacob Collier stuff, you can like it, and there's a place for intellectual anything in any creative endeavor as a case study on its own. But to the general population, there is a significant lack of empathy. Where then the newer Jacob Collier stuff, from what I've listened to, is more repeated, is a little bit more catchy. It's a little bit more fun. He still sounds like Kermit, but at least it's a little bit more fun. Even with we love Wolfpack, Corey Wong, Clowncore. We love Dirty Loops. Right? There's this level of sophistication, but it's still catchy and doesn't forget the main purpose, which is fun, which I think is highly valuable. But you said that significantly more nuanced than I could ever, and I love that. But Kayako and I, we were having this my wife, we were having the conversation the other day. It's like, why we love jazz and like we love big band jazz, like alternative forms of jazz. Why can we not like some of these other popular art, like these relatively popular artists within the scene? And Kayako's like, I just think like it's fun, it's like good, but it's just not fun. It's not catchy. And like, that's a big part. It's kind of like even with the film industry, it's like, we're seeing like, Minecraft is getting hyper down-liked. And then we are seeing like the decline of Borderlands that was like totally crashed. But how did the Mario movie that has the wackiest cast, that has the like objectively like a really shallow writing and like plot, how did that have so much success? And I think the one thing, like it's respect to the audience and like that empathy there, that practical empathy and like doing something for the core audience and the demographic, which isn't really fully related to what we're talking about. But there's also something about like, again, it was fun. It was something that parents and kids could just like relax and like do this. But with Minecraft, it's like too different. With Borderlands, it was like pushing it was too on the nose. It was too soapboxy on some things or like whatever. And I think, I don't know, there's that I want to throw into as well. This is a very nuanced conversation that I'm thinking about a lot in different perspectives as someone that loves video games and movies. And I really, the point of all of this is I really, really hope, and I have a lot of optimism towards the future of creative culture and continuing to raise the standard, because for the last decade, it really has feel like we've accidentally, maybe not even intentionally, lowered the standard. And it was it became criminally obvious when people started streaming speed runs of beats. It's like they can build the beat in 30 seconds on Twitch. It's like, all right, okay, we need to stop paying for those types of records. I really hope that we continue as creatives to raise the standard. And I really hope that investors, the bigwigs, the managers, the people that are undoubtedly a major part of where laymen open their wallets and use their money to endorse different aspects. I hope that they continue to find financial reasons that align with the creative purpose. And I hope, and I think that we're starting to see that, and I hope that this continues in that direction. And I don't know if you've felt that in societal as well.
Let me hit three things. I know we could probably talk for hours and hours, but three things I really want to hit. One of which I just missed. First of all, and I know you were saying this and you agree with this, but I just want to make sure there's plenty of space for just like intellectual things, music and art in and of themselves. I think some people will see some videos, someone do just mindlessly shredding on guitar, and like you can't even hear what they're playing, and like, oh, it's not emotional. Well, I think there is an emotion which is like wonder or impressed or awe, right? And I think there's a very human and emotional. This is why we watch the Olympics, and they're emotional to us. This like human feats, I think, is emotional, and I think this is why guitar solos that get a little shreddy can be really emotional for us, because it's like, all the times that guy was supposed to watch this movie with his friends and said no because he was going to practice. For how many years he did that, and that's what you're hearing. I agree that sometimes it feels like all it is like, whoa, you're really good. But I think, whoa, you're really good is cool. And I think that's fine. And so if you're the kind of person out there that's just like, you just shed all day and you just are like gnarly on your instrument, like that's all you need to offer. That's all you need. Like, you don't freak out. You're not cheap. Like that is plenty. We need that. And I think when that can come into more sort of poetic, longer forms, there's a lot of magic that can happen there. But I think intellectual, heady things, both in music and other disciplines of art, in and of themselves have tremendous value and inspire us. I'll watch some video of someone shredding on piano and it's like, oh shoot, back to practicing, and it keeps my motor going, So that's really important. Two, I want to say, circling back to the hip hop thing, I don't think hip hop is going anywhere, and I know you don't think that either. And I do think what is happening with a lot of hip hop and a lot of the hip hop that is going to stay around is just going to have a lot of live instruments in it. I mean, we saw this starting back with Dre back in the day. We had the whole crate digging era, and then Dre's like, well, what if we just all played this? And that started a whole new thing. And not everybody does that. Some people do kind of the crate digging approach, or like in today's world, finding a loop, putting in a sampler and going, blah, 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 blah. People do that, and that's cool. That is very hip hop as part of the tradition, all for it. But there's a 30-year-old tradition now of live instruments in hip hop that I think will continue. Obviously, Kendrick is a huge, what's the word?
Anderson .Paak as well.
Anderson, sure. There's lots of people like Kendrick. I know this is really sensitive, Tori. I think Kendrick might be the guy, might be the GOAT, but he's definitely in the conversation. He is an all live instruments guy. I mean, there's 808s and stuff and sampled drums, but there's always live piano and live strings. So like on the upper echelons of hip hop, there's still live stuff, and that will increase, I think, to happen. The other thing about hip hop is realizing that hip hop is jazz. Hip hop is like a direct continuation of everything that jazz was. I really recommend studying like the history of jazz, especially bebop and why bebop happened and how this transitioned into hip hop. Robert Glasper, one of my big heroes, love Robert Glasper, talks about this a lot, about hip hop and jazz and how they are kind of the same lineage. And so hip hop will evolve the same way jazz evolved. And the hallmark of jazz isn't chords. It isn't 2-5-1. So like a lot of people think it's not 7 chords, not fancy stuff. It's improvisation. That is what jazz really is. Later in jazz's history, it started to get really sophisticated language, but what jazz is improvising. And so, and I think you see this in hip hop a lot with rapping and freestyling. And so I think that lineage is going to continue. So what I'm saying is, if you're a hip hop person out there and you make like 808s every single day, I don't think that's going to go anywhere, but I think it's going to get increasingly more kind of hybrid with live, and it's going to get more kind of improvised. And so having these kind of skill sets is going to be very important for you and for the genre going forward. So yeah, I have a lot of hope for hip hop, and I think the hip hop people out there don't need to be like, oh shoot, let me go find a bunch of singer-songwriters. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think hip hop is just going to start to adapt, and you just better be ready for when you get those live strings in your session in Pro Tools one day, and like you know what to do, because that's going to happen more and more. Live pianos, whatever, live bass instead of 808s. We're hearing a lot in hip hop. And then my last thought of the day is like this whole like return to sophistication and nuanced conversations, and like slow down. Be careful of getting swayed by an Instagram post about politics and making really fast music and throwing in a loop and a beat lifestyle. We all need to fight against this. Like this is the crusade right now that is going to equip us to handle the real problems like poverty and death and all these things. We need to be in a place where we are working well, and we're smart, and we're able and we're equipped to handle these real problems by slowing down and getting our brains working again. And I think as musicians, like we are like the forefront of this whole thing. Like we are creating human culture as musicians. Every time you like bounce something out, send it to mastering and put it into DistroKid or whatever, like you are creating culture. You are creating the world that we live in. We have so much power. Filmmakers too, obviously, and I mean all artists, but we create our culture. So I hope that people kind of put on their uniform a little bit as creators and take this serious. I'm not saying we only make serious songs. I love hilarious songs and songs about anything that is not serious. But like this is our job is to kind of steer the world away from wherever it's going. So like do what you have to do. Like get your screen time down to 30 minutes or less. Like come on. Like just take care of these things. Go on a walk. Like breathe. Do something. Like we need to, like this is so important.
Go on
for us
a long
to, like,
run.
yeah, Dee Kei, yeah. By the way, dude, legend. Just like seeing you're running the past couple of years. My goodness, man. If you guys don't know Dee Kei or follow him personally, this guy is serious.
Masochist. That's the word you're looking for.
But as musicians, like we just have so much responsibility, I guess is the short way to say it. And so like take care of yourself, take care of your brain. Like I said, get your screen time down. Like be nice, read books, like smarten up, like because the world needs us to put out good things if the world's going to be good. So it is a little bit more of, I think, a sacred responsibility than I think we realize. Sometimes we just are like pulling in the files and mixing it and sending it out and posting it, but like you realize every time we do that, we're creating the world. Like that's what creators are. We're creating the world. It's not just music. So like take it seriously and try and just have that in your mind as you're making this music. Like you are creating the world. Like what kind of world do you want?
I love that. The idea of like honoring the idea of creating creatives and our and fully understanding the responsibility of those that we're blessed with or just happen to be creative and are incapable of being anything else. I really love that. It's very honorable to take it so seriously. I love that. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much, Gavin, for joining me on this longer episode. I think that was really insightful, both from a technical level as well as from a philosophical level, and from a person that is so deeply thoughtful, and you have a lot of empathy for, and usually I'm the one that's like playing like the, not devil's advocate, but like kind of breaking down more generalized ideas and bringing up the nuance in it. But I love that. Thank you for joining me on this episode. Maybe we'll see each other more when we go out to Utah or whatever. Is there anything else that you want to say as we close out the episode?
No, not really. Just, everyone just grind. Like, just make it the best you can, but also slow down. Just like stop seeing this like it's a big sweatshop and we're just making beats. Like, we're making art, we're living life, make it the best you can, make it real. It's never enough. Like, there's never too deep you can go. Like, just because Serb and Guinea pulls up the waves 1176 doesn't mean you should, like, find what works for you. Do your thing. Don't just like, this guy uses this, so I'm going to do this, turn it this way, and I'm good. Like, just keep going. Just have that sort of endless hunger for getting the next thing.
Yeah. Curiosity goes a long way. And on that note, wait, hold on. If people are interested in potentially wanting to hire you for different things, where do they go? Do they just go to your website? DM you on Instagram? What's the best place?
Either way is fine. Maybe it's a little comfier for me if you email me through my website, but I'll probably see your message. I like really try to avoid social media as much as I can, so it might be like a week before I see a message. But if you email me through my website, I'll probably see it quicker.
Sweet.
Yeah.
There you go. And on that note, happy mixing, my friends, and stay saucy.